My name is Rose. I'm 32 years old, and while most people get gifts for Christmas, my parents decided to give me a surprise $1,800 bill for a luxury dinner I never even asked for. I stared at the banking app on my phone, a mug of hot tea warming my hands. The comma in my savings account balance was a new friend, one I hadn't met throughout my scraping by 20s. Back then, Christmas meant maxing out a credit card just for bus fare home to the suburbs and praying my card wouldn't decline when buying a round of drinks for old high school friends. But this year was different. At 32, I'd finally landed the senior marketing manager role after 5 years of grinding. I was solvent, stable, and desperately craving peace. My plan for Christmas Eve was simple and glorious: spicy Thai takeout, a bottle of moderately priced Cabernet, and watching Die Hard on my comfortable, paid-for couch. My phone vibrated against the coffee table, the sudden buzz shattering the silence of my apartment. The screen lit up with "Dad." My stomach did a familiar little flip, not the good kind. It was the tight, sour sensation that anticipated a guilt trip, a lecture on why I was still single, or a request for a small loan until payday. I took a deep breath and answered. "Hey, Dad. Merry almost Christmas." "Rose! There she is, the big shot." Howard's voice boomed so loud I had to pull the phone away from my ear. Background noise suggested he was already somewhere public and loud. "Listen, your mother and I have been talking. Forget sitting alone in that sad little apartment of yours for Christmas Eve. We're celebrating." I frowned, setting my tea down. Celebrating what? I thought we were just doing gifts at your place on Christmas Day, like usual. "Celebrating you, honey, your big promotion, your success." He paused for dramatic effect, a salesman winding up for the pitch. "We booked a table, tonight, 7 o'clock, at the Obsidian Room." My breath actually hitched. The Obsidian Room wasn't just a restaurant in our city, it was a statement piece. It was dark wood, polished brass, and hushed tones. It was where senators ate steaks with CEOs, and where the velvet ropes outside were thicker than my arm. It was also notoriously, outrageously expensive. "Dad," I stammered, "that place is insanely pricey. Are you sure? I'm perfectly happy with Mom's lasagna, really." "Nonsense. Don't be cheap, Rose. It's unbecoming now that you're management." He laughed, a barking sound. "Only the best for our girl. We want to treat you properly. You've made it. Let us show off a little." "We want to treat you." The words hung in the air, glittering like tinsel. It sounded like a genuine gift. It sounded like they were finally seeing me as a successful adult they respected, not just a project that needed fixing. Against my better judgment, against 32 years of experience, a small, hopeful part of me softened. Maybe this time was different. "Okay," I said, ignoring the knot tightening in my gut. "I'll see you at 7. I hung up, staring at my reflection in the dark TV screen. I wanted to believe them. I really did. But history had taught me that with Howard and Evelyn, nothing was ever truly free. The wind whipped down the avenue, carrying the sharp sting of Lake Michigan and the smell of roasting chestnuts. I pulled my wool coat tighter around my neck, my heels clicking rhythmically on the salted pavement. Even the sidewalk outside the Obsidian Room felt more expensive than my entire street. The valet, a young man in a heavy coat and a gold-trimmed cap, gave me a polite nod as I approached the heavy, smoked glass doors. Inside, the city's roar vanished, replaced by the low, velvet hum of a cello and the clinking of heavy silver. The air smelled of expensive wood smoke, aged leather, and the kind of perfume that costs more than my monthly car payment. "Rose, over here." I didn't have to look for them. My mother, Evelyn, was waving from a plush circular booth in the center of the room. She was draped in a cream-colored faux fur stole, her hair sprayed into a rigid golden helmet. Beside her, Howard sat with his chest puffed out, looking like a man who owned the building, rather than a man who had been between projects for most of my teenage years. "You look professional," Mom said as I sat down, her eyes scanning my outfit for any hint of a bargain. "A bit tired, maybe? That promotion must be taking a toll." "I'm fine, Mom, just busy," I said, unfolding my heavy linen napkin. "This place is incredible. Are you sure about this?" "Nonsense," Howard boomed, his voice carrying to the neighboring tables. He slapped the oversized, leather-bound menu. "To my daughter, the senior marketing manager." He raised a hand, snapping his fingers at a passing waiter. I winced. In a place like this, you didn't snap your fingers. You caught an eye, you nodded. But Howard enjoyed the power of the service industry too much to be subtle. A waiter appeared, his face a mask of professional neutrality. "Good evening. May I start you with something to drink?" "We need something special," Howard said, not even looking at the wine list. "The 2015 Napa Cabernet, the Reserve. Bring the bottle." I caught a glimpse of the price list on the table tent. That bottle was $420. My pulse spiked. I opened my mouth to suggest a glass of the house red, but Howard was already deep into a story about his consulting work, gesturing wildly with his hands. "And bring the seafood tower for the table," Evelyn added, her voice airy. "The grand one, with the lobster tails." The waiter bowed and retreated. I looked at the menu in my hands. The cheapest appetizer was $35. The steaks started at $90. I felt a cold sweat prickling at my hairline. I told myself to relax. They invited you, they said they wanted to treat you. But as Evelyn began bragging to the table next to us, total strangers, about how I was single-handedly running the city's marketing now, the pet in my stomach grew. It wasn't the food I was worried about anymore. It was the performance. And in my family, the audience always ended up paying for the show. The seafood tower arrived like a shimmering monument to excess. 3 tiers of shaved ice were topped with chilled lobster tails, king crab legs, and oysters that looked like gray pearls in their shells. A faint mist of dry ice curled around the base, smelling of salt and expensive machinery. "Eat up, Rose," Howard urged, cracking a crab leg with a satisfying, visceral snap. He dunked the meat into a bowl of drawn butter, droplets of gold splashing onto the white tablecloth. "You can't get this at your little local deli, can ya?" I picked up an oyster, the cold shell biting into my thumb. I swallowed it, but the brine felt heavy in my throat. I couldn't stop looking at the way my parents were eating, not with appreciation, but with a sort of frantic greed. Evelyn was already flagging down the waiter again before she'd even finished her first prawn. "Another round of those bacon-wrapped scallops," she directed, her eyes darting around the room to see who was watching. "And bring my daughter the Wagyu ribeye, the large cut. She needs the protein. She's a very busy woman." "Mom, really, the sea bass is fine," I tried to interject, but she waved me off with a hand heavy with costume jewelry that she'd tried to pass off as heirlooms. "Don't be modest, darling. It's Christmas, and we have so much to be thankful for. Tell me," she leaned in, her voice dropping to a loud stage whisper, "is it true your new bonus is in the 5-figure range? I told Mrs. Higgins at the garden club that you were practically the CFO by now." My face burned. The couple at the next table, a pair in their 60s who looked like they'd been born in Kashmir, glanced over. I caught the woman's eye. She looked at my parents with a mixture of amusement and pity. "I'm a manager, Mom, not the CFO, and my bonus is for my retirement fund, not for—" I gestured vaguely at the table, which was now disappearing under plates of truffle fries, creamed spinach, and the heavy iron-seared Wagyu. "Retirement?" Howard laughed, his face flushed a deep, alarming shade of beet red from the wine. "Live a little. Waiter, another bottle. The 2015 is gone." As the night wore on, the table became a graveyard of luxury. Half-eaten steaks, discarded shells, and empty wine glasses littered the space. The pace was frantic, a blur of silver and porcelain. Every time I tried to steer the conversation towards something real, how they were doing, how Dad's back was feeling, they steered it back to my new wealth. They weren't talking to me. They were talking to the version of me they wanted the world to see, a golden goose. I felt smaller and smaller with every bite I took, the rich food turning to lead in my stomach. I watched my father lean back, patting his stomach with a look of smug satisfaction as he signaled for the dessert menus. He looked like a king, and for a fleeting moment, I actually felt guilty for doubting him. He looked so happy. Maybe he really was just proud of me. The dessert was a masterpiece of dark chocolate and gold leaf, accompanied by 3 espressos that arrived in cups so thin they felt like eggshells. The bitterness of the coffee was a sharp contrast to the sugary decadence of the meal, but it did nothing to settle the mounting dread in my chest. Howard leaned back, loosening his belt a notch with a sigh of deep, oily satisfaction. "Now that," he declared, "was a meal. Truly, a meal fit for a senior manager's family." Evelyn smiled, dabbing a corner of her mouth with her napkin. "It really makes all those years of frozen dinners when you were a kid worth it, doesn't it, Rose? Seeing you here, able to enjoy this?" I didn't answer. I just watched the waiter. He was approaching from the side, a small black leather folder tucked discreetly under his arm. He moved with a practiced grace, setting the folder down on the exact center of the table. He didn't say a word, just gave a polite, tight-lipped smile and vanished back into the shadows of the dining room. Silence fell over the table. It wasn't the comfortable silence of a family satisfied by a good meal. It was a heavy, expectant silence. Howard didn't reach for the folder. He didn't even look at it. Instead, he took a slow, deliberate sip of his espresso, his eyes fixed on the gold-embossed logo of the restaurant on the wall. "Well," Howard said finally, his voice casual, as if he were discussing the weather. He extended a finger and slowly, steadily pushed the leather folder across the white linen toward me. "We should probably get going before the snow gets too thick." The folder came to a rest an inch from my hand. I stared at it. I could smell the leather. "Dad?" I said, my voice sounding small in the vast vaulted room. "What is this?" "The bill, honey," Evelyn said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. She reached over and patted my hand. "We're so proud of you. We were saying in the car on the way here how wonderful it is that Rose has finally arrived. We knew you'd want to do this for us. A little thank you for everything we've sacrificed to get you to that fancy office." My heart did a slow, painful thud against my ribs. I opened the folder. My eyes blurred for a second, then snapped into focus on the number at the bottom. $1,842.67. The number felt like a physical blow to the stomach. That wasn't just a nice dinner. That was my mortgage payment. That was the emergency fund I'd spent 2 years building. That was the peace of mind I'd finally found, sitting there on a piece of thermal paper, waiting to be devoured. "You're joking," I whispered, looking up at them. Howard's jovial mask didn't slip, but his eyes hardened. "Joking? Rose, don't be dramatic. You're sicking 6 figures now. This is pocket change to a senior manager. We brought you into this world. We supported your creative dreams when you were broke. The least you can do is buy your parents a Christmas dinner." "You said you were treating me," I said, my voice shaking with a mix of hurt and rising fury. "You chose the wine. You chose the Wagyu. You chose the most expensive place in the city." "And we chose it because we knew our successful daughter could afford it," Evelyn snapped, her voice losing its sweetness. "Don't be a Scrooge, Rose. It's Christmas. Don't ruin the night over a few dollars." A few dollars?
To them, my hard work was just a resource for them to mine. The realization hit me colder than the wind outside. This wasn't a celebration of my success, it was a raid on it.
The white linen of the tablecloth suddenly felt like a shroud. I looked at the bill again, the black ink of the numbers pulsing against the paper. Around us, the muffled sounds of the restaurant, the clink of heavy crystal, the low, melodic laughter of people who actually liked each other, felt like they were coming from miles away. "I'm not paying for this, Dad," I said. My voice was surprisingly steady, though my heart was hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. Howard's face, already flushed from the wine, turned a shade of purple that matched the dregs in his glass. He leaned forward, his large hands flat on the table, crushing a stray breadcrumb. "Excuse me? What did you just say?" "I said no. I'll pay for my dinner and my drink, but I didn't order a $400 bottle of wine, and I certainly didn't order a second one to go." I pushed the folder back toward the center of the table. It felt like a lead weight. Evelyn's fork clattered against her porcelain plate with a sharp metallic ring. "Rose, how can you be so selfish? After everything we've done for you, we spent our lives making sure you had the best opportunities. I skipped vacations for years so you could have those piano lessons you hated. And I spent those years practicing until my fingers hurt because you told me it was the only way I'd ever be refined enough," I retorted, the old bitterness rising up like bile. "This isn't about piano lessons, Mom. This is about you inviting me to a dinner you couldn't afford and expecting me to subsidize your lifestyle." "Subsidize?" Howard spat the word like it was a slur. "Listen to you. You get a little title on a business card and a cubicle with a view, and suddenly you're too good for the people who raised you? We are your parents. In a decent family, the successful children take care of the elders. It's the natural order of things." I looked at him, really looked at him. I saw the fine lines of entitlement etched around his mouth, the way he wore his expensive-looking blazer like armor. He wasn't proud of my success, he was envious of it. He saw my bank account as his own personal safety net for the reckless choices he'd made his entire life. "There's nothing natural about trapping your daughter into a $2,000 debt on Christmas Eve," I said, my voice rising slightly. A woman at the table behind Howard turned her head, her eyebrows arching in judgment. Evelyn noticed. She always noticed. She immediately shifted tactics, her eyes welling with practiced crocodile tears. "Oh, Howard, she's right. We're just burdens now. Old, useless burdens. We should have known she'd turn out like this, cold and calculating, just like your sister." "Don't you bring Aunt Sarah into this," I snapped. "You're breaking your mother's heart, Rose," Howard said, his voice dropping into a low, menacing growl. "Pay the bill, now. Don't make me cause a scene in a place like this." The irony was staggering. He was the one who had already caused the scene. He was the one who had weaponized the holiday. I felt the last shred of my good daughter guilt snap. It didn't feel like a break, it felt like a release. The air in the booth felt thick, like I was trying to breathe through a heavy velvet curtain. My parents sat there, twin statues of expectation, waiting for me to surrender. In their minds, I was still the little girl who would do anything to keep the peace. But that girl had spent too many nights working late and too many years counting pennies to let them steal this victory from her. I raised my hand. I didn't snap my fingers,
I simply caught the waiter's eye with a firm, clear nod. He arrived in seconds, his face a neutral mask of service. "Is everything all right, Miss Miller?" "Not quite," I said. I could feel my parents' eyes boring into the side of my head. "We'd like to settle the bill, but we'll be splitting it." The waiter's eyebrow twitched, the only sign of his surprise. "Of course. How would you like that divided?" "Rose, don't be ridiculous," Howard hissed, his voice a low, vibrating growl. He tried to grab the leather folder, but I placed my hand firmly on top of it. I looked the waiter in the eye. "I will pay for the Cedas, 1 glass of the Napa Cabernet, and my espresso. These two," I gestured to my parents, "will be responsible for the rest. The seafood towers, the second bottle of wine, the Wagyu, the to-go desserts, everything else." The silence that followed was deafening. Even the cello music seemed to stop. Evelyn let out a sharp, theatrical gasp, her hand flying to her throat as if I'd just slapped her. Howard's face went from purple to a ghostly mottled gray. I see," the waiter said, his voice dipping into a lower, more cautious tone. "I will be right back with the itemized receipts." As he walked away, Howard leaned over the table, his breath smelling of expensive wine and old resentment. "You have no idea what you're doing, Rose. You are humiliating us. In front of these people? Do you know who sits at the next table?" "I don't care about the next table, Dad," I said, my voice cold and hard. "And I don't care about your appearances. What I care about is that you lied to me. You said you were treating me to celebrate my success, but you didn't want to celebrate me. You wanted to consume me." "We are your family," Evelyn wailed, her eyes darting around to ensure she had an audience for her grief. "How can you be so heartless on Christmas Eve?" "Being family isn't a license to steal," I replied. I felt a strange, light sensation in my chest. The guilt was gone, replaced with a crystalline clarity. I wasn't the one ruining Christmas. They had ruined it the moment they looked at me and saw a checkbook instead of a daughter.
The waiter returned with 2 separate slips of paper. He laid them side by side on the table with the precision of a surgeon. On the left, my bill, $82 plus tax. On the right, theirs, $1,760.67. I didn't hesitate. I pulled my card from my wallet, the matte black one I'd earned with 3 years of 60-hour weeks, and tucked it into my folder. "Here is mine," I said quietly, "and I'm adding a 30% tip on my portion. The service was excellent." The waiter took my card with a respectful nod. Howard, meanwhile, was staring at his slip of paper as if it were written in an alien language. His hands were shaking. He fumbled for his wallet, pulling out a battered leather bifold that's seen better decades. He produced a silver credit card, one I knew was near its limit because he'd asked me to help him with the minimum payment just 3 months ago. He handed it to the waiter without looking him in the eye. The next 3 minutes felt like 3 hours. The restaurant seemed to go quiet, the ambient chatter fading into a dull roar in my ears. I watched the waiter disappear toward the terminal. I watched my mother's face transform from indignant rage into a mask of pure, cold panic. She knew. She knew exactly what was about to happen. The waiter returned. He didn't put the card back on the table. He held it between 2 fingers, leaning in close to Howard. "I'm sorry, sir," he whispered, though in the silence it felt like a shout. "The transaction was declined. Do you have another form of payment?" "Try it again," Howard barked, his voice cracking. "It's a glitch. The bank, it's Christmas Eve. They probably flagged it for security." "I've tried it 3 times, sir." Evelyn looked at me, her eyes wide and pleading. The Scrooge talk was gone. The ungrateful daughter narrative had dissolved. "Rose, don't do this. Just put it on yours. We'll pay you back. We'll Zelle you on Monday, I swear." "No, Mom," I said. "You won't. You never do." "Rose, please." Howard's bravado had completely evaporated. He looked old. He looked small. "We're going to get kicked out. They'll call the police. You want your father arrested on Christmas?" "I want my father to be a man of his word," I said. I stood up, smoothing the wrinkles out of my silk blouse. My card was returned. I tucked it away. "Call Tommy. He's always been your favorite, and he's the one you've been bragging about supporting all year. Maybe he can help you." I didn't wait for their answer. I didn't wait to hear Howard scream or see Evelyn's tears. I turned my back on the most expensive table in the room and walked toward the exit. As I pushed through the heavy glass doors, the freezing Chicago wind hit me like a slap to the face. But for the first time in years, I didn't shiver. I felt clean. I felt light. Behind me, through the glass, I could see them frantically huddled over a cell phone, Howard's face buried in his hands. I stepped onto the sidewalk, the snow crunching under my heels, and I didn't look back. The snow was falling in thick, silent flakes now, turning the city into a blurred landscape of white and gray. My phone wouldn't stop vibrating in my pocket. Buzz, buzz, buzz. I knew what it was without looking, a barrage of frantic texts from my mother, and switched the phone to silent. Then, with a deep breath of the freezing air, I turned it off entirely. The silence that followed was the best Christmas gift I'd ever received. I walked 3 blocks away from the neon glow of the high-end district until I found Benny's, a 24-hour diner with a flickering "open" sign and windows fogged with the steam of 100 griddle-cooked burgers. I pushed inside, the bell above the door chiming a cheerful, tinny greeting. The air here didn't smell like truffle oil or vintage oak. It smelled of burnt coffee, maple syrup, and home. "Rose, over here!" In a corner booth, my best friend Sarah waved me over. She was wearing a faded Christmas sweater with a cat in a Santa hat and was halfway through a massive slice of cherry pie. I slid into the vinyl seat opposite her, the material cold and familiar. "You look like you've seen a ghost," Sarah said, pushing a spare mug of coffee toward me. "How was the grand celebration at the Temple of Excess?" "It was expensive," I said, wrapping my hands around the heavy ceramic mug. The heat seeped into my frozen fingers. "I walked out, Sarah. I paid for my fish and left them with the rest." Sarah's fork stopped halfway to her mouth. Her eyes went wide. "You actually did it? You stood up to the Howard and Evelyn show?" "I did." I took a sip of the coffee. It was cheap, bitter, and perfect. They tried to guilt me with the "we raised you" speech, but for the first time, it didn't work. I realized that if I keep paying their bills, I'm not being a good daughter. I'm just being an accomplice to their delusions. We sat there for an hour, talking about everything and nothing. We talked about my new job, the real parts of it, not the CFO fantasy my parents wanted. We laughed about a terrible movie we'd seen in college. There was no posturing. There was no audience to impress. As I looked out the window at the blue-tinted darkness of Christmas Eve, I felt a profound sense of peace. My parents would eventually get home. Tommy would likely bail them out, and I'd probably be the villain in the family group chat for the next 6 months. But as the waitress came by and topped off our mugs with a warm smile, I realized I didn't mind being the villain in a story that was built on lies. I had earned my success. I had earned my stability. And tonight, for the first time, I had earned my freedom. "Merry Christmas, Rose," Sarah said, raising her coffee mug. I clinked my mug against hers, the sound solid and real. "Merry Christmas, Sarah." I took a bite of pie. It was sweet, tart, and cost exactly $6. It was the most delicious thing I'd eaten all year.